So yeah, let's try that game. Hi, I'm Alan, and I'm going to be talking about making friends for fun and profit. If you hadn't worked that out yet, but that's just because I needed a catchy title, and getting people to play your games isn't as exciting as that. So really, I want to tell you that the games you're making, you should be getting people to actually play them. A novel thought. Because if you're going to be making something that nobody's going to be playing, what's even the point? It's like you might think, oh, I'm just practicing. I'm just practicing making games, and then eventually I'll make something good, and then I'll get people to play that. But you're just totally wrong there, because you're not actually practicing the things you need to be practicing. If people aren't playing your games, then you're not actually finding out how to make good games. You're just finding out how to program things. And some of you might say, oh yeah, I just want to learn how to program stuff, and it's just a technical challenge, and I don't care if anybody plays it. But you really should be caring, because you can have the same technical challenges making games that people are playing as you do making games that people don't play, and it's far more rewarding if people are playing your games. So really, there's no excuse to not be aiming to be making things that people will want to play. So I'm going to talk a bit about two ways you can help people to want to play your game. The first way is, I guess, the hard way. It's just to make better games. So I guess I'll talk a little bit about that. But I also want to just discuss that if you know more people, then more people might play your games. But specifically the kind of people who might help make your games better. If you know them, then you will be able to get better feedback from them. So really, you should all be trying to talk to and integrate with the game development community, and because it's a really nice and friendly community in my experience, and it has a lot to offer people who are trying to make games, surprisingly enough. So a little bit of context, I guess. Who am I to tell you these things? So if you don't know, if you haven't met me, I'm Alan. I started making games almost exactly 7 years ago when I joined this society in 2006, which is a long time ago now. And I joined the society and I started making games, and they were pretty terrible back then. But more recently, like 2 years ago, I released my first commercial game for iOS and Android, and I also had a sponsored Flash version. It's called These Robotic Hearts of Mine. It was a narrative-driven puzzle game. People apparently liked it. I made a game called Chip Snake. I made a game called Brick Smash Smash, which is like recursive breakout. And most recently, 3 months ago, I released a game called Soccer Bond, which is a chemistry-based puzzle game. It's gone okay. I'm really happy with that. And I've made a bunch of other games. I counted yesterday, and I've made over 60 games. Only a fraction of those are good, and only a fraction of the good games ever got finished. But it's a lot of games that I've worked on over the last 7 years. So that's kind of where I am now. Like I said, my game Soccer Bond was released 3 months ago. Last week it was greenlit, so it will be coming to Steam next year. So that's pretty cool. By some people's definition of success, I would have made it. Who knows? But I'm going to flash back all the way to the start of 2010. I graduated uni mid 2009, and then I spent half a year bumming around making games, and then I'd say around the start of 2010 I started actually going to things, possibly partially because I didn't have what game design anymore. I'd moved away from Coventry, and I didn't have a lot of people near where I was living who I could talk about game development with. So I started finding some more people. So at the start of 2010, I made some games. They were mostly pretty terrible. I was an unknown developer. And just 2 years later, by the end of 2011, I'd released a commercial game. I'd exhibited it at a fairly big expo in London, and I'd become the maintainer of a pretty big, popular Flash framework called Flashback. And that's just in those 2 years. Oh, am I going to have internet? No, I probably have internet. I should have loaded this up already. So I'm just gonna talk about the. Do I actually have internet? Is it just gonna? Come on, you can do it. Yeah. So in those 2 years, I just attended a whole bunch of game dev events around the country. So like start of January, I went to a TIG jam, just a weekend-long game jam in Cambridge. Then 2 weeks later, I did a global game jam in Bristol. I did London Dare, which is just online, but it's a really nice community, or at least it was back then, and you could actually get to know people through it, and people would play each other's games, and it was really welcoming. I went to another jam in Cambridge, went to a conference in London, and then there was a game jam the weekend after that. I went to that. I did a Reddit game jam. I made a stupid little game, and people eventually played it because it was a competition to make games that fit into a ad-sized space, and then they got put in the Reddit ad rotation, and that was pretty cool. So a lot of people played that game. I did another London Dare, but this time I'd met people in Cambridge, and I got on well with them, and there was a nice community up there. So I thought, okay, well, for this London Dare, it's an online event, but I'm going to travel to Cambridge and hang out with these people, and I made a game there. Then I came back here, I did another competition. I got to hang out with people at the society I hadn't seen for a while. I did an online competition for the Flashpunk community. I started a game that eventually got finished, and did okay for me. I went up to Cambridge again. Then went to 2011, went to Cambridge again. So I'm getting to know the guys in Cambridge pretty well. I'm seeing them over and over again, and some of them I'm really good friends with now, and that's helped me a lot. And it's not because I decided, oh, how can I sneak into these people and leech their success. It's like, these people are cool. They're doing cool things in Cambridge. I'm going to go to the cool things they're organising. I went there again, went to a game jam in London where they were making games for an arcade machine that they had set up. So everybody was just jamming for a weekend, making games that could be put onto an arcade cabinet. I went to a game jam, I organised a game jam in Bristol because there was not really many people in Bristol doing stuff, but I knew a few people in the area, and I was like, okay, well, let's do a game jam. I went to a different London game jam, another jam in Cambridge, another London Dare in Cambridge. There's a party that happens in London. It's just a bunch of multiplayer indie games. Like half the people there are game developers. You go there, you drink, play fun games, play Johann Sebastian Joust, hang out with interesting people, meet interesting people. I exhibited a game at the Eurogamer Expo. The way that happened is I had a game, I thought it was alright. There was a free submission to, like, if you have an indie game and you want to exhibit it, there's 12 slots. Just email this person with your game, with a build, and if they like it, then you'll get to exhibit. And I just submitted it. I didn't expect anything, but apparently it was interesting enough or different enough that it got selected. So I went there. I had a good time exhibiting my game at that. I got to test it on a whole bunch of people from the public who wouldn't have heard of it. And I got to hang out with other developers in the evenings. There's another game jam in London where I made a text adventure about shit snakes. I came back here. I made a game with another developer who I'd met at these jams in the previous 2 years, who lives in Oxford, and it was like, hey, there's a jam happening here in Coventry. You're not too far away. Do you want to come? And a couple of people came down, and I made a game with this guy who I really respected, and it ended up really cool. I released my game. I saw some money from it, and that was cool. And then there's another London Debt, and that's my 2 years of 2010 and 2011. So I went from being some guy who'd made some games that nobody would even care about to having made a fairly, like, I'd exhibited a game, some people knew who I was, and I knew other people, and the number of people who I could just chat to and get advice from was phenomenally higher than it was before. And that was just because I went to all these events, and I met interesting people, and I just kept meeting them, and they're all lovely and friendly. Just as one final example of that principle, Soccer Bond. Soccer Bond only exists because I met Harry Lee, who's the collaborator I did it with. I met him at GDC. Like, we were just one evening, people were talking about doing a game jam, so we were like, okay, let's make a game together. Like, we've met like this week, we get along, we like each other's company, we have similar design styles. Let's make a game in the next 4 hours. I was only at GDC because I'd met all these people in the past, and I got on well with them, and they were all saying, if you want to do more of this kind of thing, you should go to GDC, because that's where a whole bunch of international game developers gather together and hang out and meet each other. And I was only really able to justify it because some of these people I'd met were in the IGF, and if you're in the IGF, you get several free exhibitor passes. They don't get you into any of the talks, but they let you into the building and so on for free. So I was like, okay, well, you're one person, you have like 7 of these passes, would you like to give me one? And actually it was more like, hey, does anybody want one of these? And I was like, yes please. But I was in a position where they were likely to say, yeah, I know who you are, yes, I do want to give you one of these, because they knew who I was. We only started making the game together because, I mean, Harry knew who I was. Like, he played these robotic hearts of mine, and he really liked it. And I knew who he was. Actually, like, he was a bit modest. It didn't come out until the evening that we were talking about making a game together. He'd made several games that I really respected. So apparently, I lose the modesty competition there. But like, we respected each other's games, and that's good. Ryan Roth did the music. He's done the music for some other games, including Starseed Pilgrim. Like, the way that he got his music in our game was, I was at GDC again this year, and before that I was traveling around North America. I was staying with some indie developers in Toronto. He was friends with those developers. I met him, I hung out with him several times, and he was a cool guy. And then I saw him again at GDC, and I saw Harry at the same time. I was like, Harry, we should get Ryan to do the music for our game. And we chatted, and yeah, let's do this. And the only reason that happened was because I knew the guy. I was like, yeah, you're a cool guy, you do cool music, let's do it that way. So it kind of really is all about who you know. Like, when you're collaborating with people, the more talented people you're friends with, the more talented people you get to collaborate with. So where do you get to meet people? I gave a broad overview of all the things I did in that 2-year period, but there's local meetups. I organise a monthly one in Birmingham called Midlands Indies, which you should all go to because Birmingham's really close, and you get to just drink and hang out with people for an evening. And what's not to like? There's other events around the country and around the world. So if you're at home during the holidays, there may well be a game dev group where you live. There's a very big one in London that's really worth going to. There's a decent one in Bristol, I believe now. So there are several local meetup groups that are worth going to. Game jams, like the 48-hour jams that we have here, they're really good, but it's not the same just meeting the same people over and over again. Benefit of a game jam that's not here, is you get to meet new people, and there are loads of game jams happening. So there's the one that happens frequently in Cambridge is called TIG Jam. There's also several that happen in London from time to time. There's the Global Game Jam, which happens in January. So there's a lot of game jams. There's one in Birmingham this very weekend. So there's a lot of things worth going to. The World Rumpus, as I mentioned before, is just a party with multiplayer indie games and a bunch of game developers hanging out. There's several conferences. A Bit of Alright is just a day of talks, and it's really worth going to. Game Camp is an unconference where you just turn up and you go, I want to talk about something, and you write it on a whiteboard in a time slot, and then if people want to talk about that too, they'll go to the same room and you'll talk about that thing. And you can just decide, okay, I think this is an interesting thing. Nobody else is wanting to talk about it. Let's schedule something for that. Game City is perhaps the most friendly game event in the whole of the UK. It's a week-long thing in Nottingham. It was last month, and it's really good. They used to do a thing called Game City Nights, which is just an evening of talks and hanging out. So that's now being rebranded to Modern Playing. That's happening in Birmingham this Monday, and it's totally going to be worth going to. Rezzed and Eurogamer Expo. Their expos, they're not indie focused, but there are indie games being exhibited there. And also, well, for one thing, you can submit your game to be exhibited there for free. So if you have a game that's good or funny or terrible in an interesting way, there's really no reason not to send it off and say, hey, do you think this is interesting? Do you want to exhibit this? But even if you don't have anything you're exhibiting there, they're totally worth going to, because in the evenings, you've just got a whole bunch of game developers hanging out, going to the pub, going to get food, and just talking to each other, and that's a really valuable thing. If you can afford it, GDC, Indiecade PAX, there's a whole bunch of events that happen in North America, and they are worth my time, certainly, because you just get to meet so many more people, and just being able to see people regularly is really helpful for helping them to remember who you are. So just in the next month, the things that are going on, you've got launch that you're going to tomorrow, some people. That's cool. You should be doing more of that. I don't know what the event is like, I've never been, but I'm sure there will be at least some interesting people. So rather than hanging out in a bunch of game design groups and just chatting to each other, definitely go and try and find people who you've never met who are doing interesting things and just talking to them there. There's a game jam happening this weekend at Birmingham University. There's Modern Playing happening on Monday evening, somewhere in Birmingham as well. Next month, Midlands Indies happening on one evening, and there's also Londare happening next month too. So that's a whole bunch of things that you could be doing. And you can, as well as meeting people in person, which is valuable, if you can't do that, or when you're not doing that, you can talk to people online and meet people online. Tixos is a message board. It's fairly big and sprawling and maybe not as good as it has been in the past, but it's still pretty much the best place to go to kind of see what other people are working on and post about what you're working on and try and see if people find what you're working on at all interesting. Twitter is a thing that I didn't really get. I knew of its awareness, and then I went to these game jams and I met people and I'm like, oh, are you on Twitter? And so I kind of reluctantly joined Twitter, but it's just really good because if you've met somebody in person, then it's really easy to keep up to date with what they're doing, and if they're going to do the same to you, then you kind of don't need to be emailing somebody like weekly saying, oh, I'm doing this now. You kind of get that as background noise, and so you have an awareness of what people are working on, and it's just a good way of building familiarity with people, and just finding out the cool things people are working on. And it's the way that people can respond to what you're doing. If I don't know what I'm doing with a piece of art, I can just post up a piece of art and say, this is terrible, how do I fix this? Or I found collaborators by tweeting saying, I've got this game but it doesn't have sound, does anybody want to do some sound? And that's valuable. If you've met somebody in person, or if you really respect somebody's work, most game developers are really approachable. So if you just email them, okay, they might not reply because a lot of game developers are pretty terrible at replying to emails. But if they do reply, they're not going to be like, oh, why are you contacting me? They'll be like, oh, no, this thing you asked, yes, I can give you lots of advice about that. And there's also specific forums for specific technologies or things. So there's a Flashback forum, or there'd be an SFML forum, or any other game technology that you're using. There will be a community of people who also use that technology and can give you advice and help for that. And even if you don't need help with that thing, you can just post games there as well, and people will say, oh, that's an interesting thing you're doing that. So you should really go to events and meet new people. I've mentioned a few times meeting the same people over and over again. That's good, but it's also good to meet people who you don't know. But it's helpful if you know people, some people, but not others, because they might be talking and you know some people in a conversation, not others. If you know one person in that conversation, then you can just walk in there and say hi and just start listening. And you can do that if you don't know anybody, but it feels better if you know somebody. And it doesn't, it could be Notch who's in that conversation. If you know somebody who's talking to Notch, you can just do that. So actually, it's a funny anecdote. Before Minecraft got massive, Notch came to one of the jams in Cambridge. So I met him. I played a game of the board game Citadel with him. He's a nice guy. And that's a cool thing that happened. You should be showing your games to people at these events, so that they can give you feedback. I'll be talking a bit about that more a little bit later. And you should really submit your games to events. There's several things that you can just submit to for free, and if it doesn't work out, then you've not lost anything. There's also some things that you have to pay to submit to. It may or may not be worth your time to do that, depending on your game, but you should consider it. And you should totally use Twitter, and you should have a website. You should have a website with your games, so that if somebody does meet you and they want to find out, they want to see a game that you mentioned to them in passing, you don't have to go, oh yeah, well, you can't really play it online. But it's cool, I promise. But if you're talking to somebody and they find what you're saying interesting, they should be able to search your name, find your website, find your archive of games, and go, oh, this is the thing he was talking about. Yes, this is really cool. And that applies even to the terrible games, because terrible games can be really funny. But knowing people is only half of the battle. You still need to make good games. I mentioned this at the start. It's helpful because if you know smart people, then they will be able to help you make better games. And also, if you make better games, it becomes easier to meet people. So these things kind of interact with each other. So here's some of what you need to know to make a good game. They evolve. Like, you can often have an idea for something and you think, oh, this is going to be the best idea. But if you chase that, it turns out to be not that good. But if you just start making it and then think, oh, well, okay, I've implemented this. This is a bit weird. This is a weird bug, but it's a really interesting bug, and it gives me this idea.
Like that? That's an interesting
one. Ta-da. So what if you had a game about doing something before your battery ran out? That could be a thing. Like, anything can be the inspiration. So you can get inspiration in the middle of making your game that turns it into something totally different. And you should generally follow that rather than persisting with your original idea. So you should be kind of listening to the game as you're making it and seeing what it is trying to become. Constraints are really helpful and inspirational. If you have something say, oh, you can only use 2 colors in your game, that for some reason makes it far more easy for me to think up a game idea than it would be if I'm just told make a game. Even though 2 colors doesn't tell me doesn't limit what I can do in any way, for some reason it kind of sparks your imagination. Okay, well, what if I do this? And it just gives you somewhere to start with. You should generally make the simplest thing possible and then simplify it a bit more, because your game, if you have an ambitious game idea, it'll take way longer than you think it will to actually make that. So you should come up with a really simple idea, because it'll end up more complicated than you think. Particles are pretty good. You could just add them and your game gets better. Nobody will notice that it's kind of boring if it's got some flashy particles, or nobody will notice so much that the graphics are terrible. The graphics are terrible, but really, really particly. Similarly, sound. It's not optional. Your game will get much better if you add sound. It doesn't matter what the sound is. If you have a game without sound, then adding terribly awful sounds of you record yourself saying the word that the action the character is doing, and then just playing that so that every time a cell splits, you go, splits! That's better than nothing. That's hilarious. It's terrible and hilarious and brilliant. So you should really add sound. Even if you've got 5 minutes, you should just bam something out. It'll be terrible, but it'll be better than nothing. And playtesting is kind of the single most important thing that you could do. You really, it's impossible for me to overstate. It's impossible for me to state the value of playtesting. So I'm going to cover that in 2 more slides, because it's so important. Because you make good games by testing them, by getting other people to play them and see how they feel. And you need to do that before you're done. It's no use making a game and then testing it. You think, okay, I've made it, and now I'll test for bugs. People might find the bugs. No, that's not how it works. People play it, and you find that they don't understand what they're meant to be doing, and that what they're meant to be doing isn't actually as fun as you thought. And it tells you what's important. So you should be doing it at pretty much every stage of development. Like every couple of hours in a 48-hour competition, you should be going, okay, get somebody to play this. What do they not get? What is a single thing that I can do to improve this person's playing experience. And without people playing it, it's really impossible to project or to imagine what a new player will find the game to be like. You kind of have an idea in your head of, oh, this is how people play, and you're always wrong. So you get people to do that, to tell what's the most important thing you can do right now, and you also use playtesting to tell if your game is terrible, because your game is terrible. It's kind of, if your game is terrible, no, your game will be terrible. Most games are terrible. Your first prototype will be awful. It'll suck. Usually more than you realize it does. You might think, oh, okay, this is broken, but there's something to be salvaged here. And then you put it in front of somebody. At one point on playtesting, you should never really tell people what they're meant to be doing, because you get the best feedback like that. If you tell people what they're meant to be doing, then they're not having a representative experience. Sometimes, like really early on, you might need to tell them some things, but in general, try not to say anything at all. So even if you think it's good, it's probably not. And you could invest some time to improve it, and maybe you'll get something good, and maybe you won't. But you don't have infinite time. So when you have something terrible, you should always be considering, okay, what's the single thing I can do right now to make it slightly less terrible, and then is it worth my time to actually do this thing, or should I do something else? Should I move on to another project? Because you do need to be choosing wisely what you spend your time on. My personal creative process, I try and make as many games as I can. Hopefully one will be okay. For each one, I try and just get something working really quickly. Just hacking it to pieces. If I have an idea, I'll make half of the idea, and I'll program it in the easiest way possible rather than the most forward-looking way possible. I'll get a bunch of people to play it, because I don't know when I make it if it's any good. And then the thing I do then, which is a bit unusual, is I get distracted by something else. Because if it's actually a really good idea, then I'll probably come back to it. And if I don't go back to it, it probably wasn't actually that good in the first place. So that's kind of my metric for how I decide which projects are actually good and which were interesting but not worth continuing with. It's whether I want to go back to it. But you kind of need to have several projects to be able to think that way. Like, it's very easy to get attached to your games and think, oh, no, this is the first game I made and I'm just going to work for the next 6 months just finishing it off. But you don't really have enough perspective to tell if that's worth doing. So if you're going to be making a bunch of games, you need to be making them a lot of events and things. So you should try and make as many games as you possibly can, because maybe one of them will be not terrible. There's competitions here, the 2-week competitions and the 48-hour competitions. They're really useful. London Dare is a great event. It's well worth trying to make a game for that, because there's a cool sense of community, knowing that 2,000 other people are making a game for the same thing with the same theme. Click of the Month is a thing where a bunch of people on a monthly basis make a game in 2 hours. When I said making the smallest possible thing, like 2 hours is a really good time frame for trying to make the simplest possible thing. Because if it's not the simplest possible thing, you're just not going to be able to do it at all. And the kind of broken, terrible things you get out of Click of the Month are brilliant and funny and entertaining. So I highly recommend trying to do that several times, because it's only 2 hours of your life. Like, what are you gonna do in 2 hours? Watch a film? No, you could make a game. A terrible, awful game. And game jams. There's so many. So there's so many excuses to make a game. So yeah, I recommend just trying to make as many as you can. So I guess that's everything I have to say. If you have questions, you could email me, or you could tweet at me, because Twitter is amazing. Yeah. Any questions? Yep.
Is GDC, is that in the United States?
Yes, it's in San Francisco.
And it's yearly, right?
Yeah, it's in March. Yep.
Are there any good lists of all events in the UK or worldwide or something?
There's lists of online competitions at compohub.net. That's a good resource. There's not really a good resource of everything happening in the UK. I try to post about stuff to the What Game Design Forums Facebook group thing. I don't always remember, but I'm going to make an effort to do that.
Sorry, can you repeat the URL?
compohub.net. Cool.
I just want to talk about launch briefly before we